Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Thank you all for coming. Next Thursday night, December 6th, I'll be in conversation with Joshua Sperling about his new book, From Verso, A Writer of Our Time, The Life and Work of John Berger. Same time, same place. Emmanuel Iduma graduated from this program not so long ago with an extraordinary thesis called A Stranger's Pose. That thesis was a curious mixture of criticism and fiction. His thesis advisor, Claudia Larocco, wrote of it at the time, Emmanuel's ambitions weren't only formal. He wanted also to create a work that would use his own autobiography as a porous container in which to meditate on how a young Nigerian critic might speak to an international audience, both in Africa and beyond, addressing in a non-didactic manner the huge and tangled questions surrounding such themes as race, migration, history, place, and non-place. 3 years of hard alchemical work later, we get to this handsomely published volume with a foreword by Teju Cole and a glowing review in The Atlantic, the first of many, I hope. We couldn't be more proud. This is what I wrote after reading the finished work in manuscript. A Stranger's Pose begins with an impulse, driving into Mauritania at sunset on Eid al-Fitr, and ends with an unmarked grave beside the road, and a memory preserved in a stranger's glance. The writer is a traveler, not a refugee or migrant, but certainly a stranger in condition, aspiring to the position and the pose. He is guileless, but carries a camera. His eye is an other, as Rimbaud had it. At a time when more and more of us are strangers, at the mercy of others, it is perhaps time to delve into what that means, what it looks and sounds like, and what marvels appear. Iduma's book is a marvel. Please welcome Emmanuel Iduma.
Hello. Hi, it's an honor to be here and to see many friends and well-wishers, as we say in Nigeria, and foes. But that's a joke. Thank you, Levi. So I'll just get right into it. How to contemplate what outlasts what. How laughter is sometimes so involuntary, nothing should be said about happiness. How companionship is not necessarily supplied by friendship, instead its central mystery. How a lamp is left on throughout the night to keep wake. How a beard, months after being worn, fathers a face, that face orphaned when shaved. How to transfer a man's consciousness to those he leaves behind. How I am still with you. How it is still too early to say however. How I dread the after image. How the palms, long after they are held open, resemble a book, hence letters. How a tree does not know you. How you will cease to be known by your body. How little you know of me, and how your estimations are right. How I love my mother, how I love my father, how I love my sisters, how I love my brothers. How long I will remain surprised that anyone reaches a great old age. How long you must suspect that anything I write is rinsed in sentiment. How a son is a father doubled or halved. How quickly I wrote this. How no two breaths are of the same duration. How God. How to recite a psalm without weeping. How I am still with you. I wrote this on September 28th, 3 weeks after my father died. This talk is a tribute to him, but only in part. only as far as I've come to terms with his physical absence. To write as if led blind, I didn't think I was writing a book about grief until I wrote the last chapter, 3 years after the first was written. I knew it was a book about loss and desire. Desire doubled this loss, I thought at the time. But grief? Not until the book led me in the way only it could. Sentences written in the wake of sensation and perception. Writing as a kind of prophecy. Now that I turn to the book, thinking of my father, seeking to inscribe a dash between his life and mine, I see that all along I had been evaluating what he meant to me. And I'll read 2 sections from the book to highlight this. So I guess I should say at the outset that, the book is going to be in high demand tonight. And I'll leave it at that until I get to the end. I now remember an image of my father. As a 20-year-old, he had stood in front of a school building holding a book, pictured in a deliberate sway. I know him in a way I would never know him in person, as young and fixated on the future. All that youth he carried in his smile and gaze is now past. Not only his past, but also mine. I am young. All images of my youth will share this fate. There in Umuahia, on a rainy afternoon, a dead man was moved on a stretcher from hospital ward to morgue. I was sitting beside my father. The man was my father's age. I remember, as I looked at both men in a flash, what seemed like a similar serenity. One man breathless, his eyes closed. The other sitting in pain, no worry or pity in his eyes. The men who carried their dead nodded to me, bridging, if that were possible, the chasm between bereaved and comforter. In the hospital a fortnight earlier, my father had cried in pain, requesting water. Those who know these things say a man must not be given water in the moments after surgery, or else sure death. Yet my father was thirsty. Alone with him, my father's visitor approached with a bottle of water. He heard a sudden voice from behind, "Stop." When he turned, there was no one. It must have been the voice of God. He dropped the bottle and ran for the doctor, who told him he had saved the man's life. This is a story my mother told me. I believed her simply and in full. Despite her propensity to exaggerate, I know her truest sentiment was also mine. A corpse is the foremost expression of sedentary life. None of us had imagined my father unmoving. My mother told me of my father crying when he saw the state of his house. For years, he had sent money from California to Afikpo to build it on ancestral land. The house would plant his feet and my mother's feet where they belonged. But his friends had been reckless with his money, and the house amounted only to a pile of blocks spread out in ungainly fashion. He cried, she said, bent over a cornerstone. In the years that followed, he kept moving from place to place, Abuja to Lagos to Ile-Ife to Ohafia to Umuahia, shifting grounds known to an itinerant Presbyterian preacher. If a dwelling could be permanent, it would be his soul. In my family, though, a man's soul was once known as restless. My grandfather was pronounced dead more than once. Lying on the bed, he returned time and again to the world of the living. After his first death, he awoke to name his debtors, who owed him 1,000 naira and who had sold his goats without giving account. After his second death, he came speaking of how he must be buried. No, they shouldn't worry my father much, but he must be given the burial due a man his age. There was a third, final death. And then, what happens to an itinerant soul, one who does not dwell? There is hardly any way to tell. To dwell in its subtle shifts of meaning in different languages, in High German, Saxon, Old English, and Arabic, can suggest to stay in peace, to be in peace, to reflect, to settle, to be still, to stop. His soul had stopped. He has stopped. Pain had departed him. Which is why Saba Inab, while in Marrakech, tells a story. In 1711 to 710, after landing on the coast overlooking the rock, later named as Jabal-ul-Tariq, later corrupted to Gibraltar, its conqueror Tariq ibn Ziyad ordered the burning of the ships that had brought the troops from Africa. Humankind is perhaps uncertain about wanderlust, how to mitigate the growing temptation to move. The ships must be burnt. For 11 days I live in a house that does not belong to my family, but to my father's oldest friend. I have come to Afikpo, my ancestral hometown, alone. The town is noisier than I remember. In daily walks on a K Market road, I see people windmilling about, their gestures unrestrained, in the manner of city dwellers. I had thought of Afikpo until now as a village, provincial. This is not the quiet I envisioned. And since it rains on the day of my arrival, the overcast sky is sewn on my mood like a badge. My excuse for coming, I told my friends, was to meet my mother's family. My middle name is originally my maternal grandfather's. To question identity, I argued, you look in both agnatic and uterine directions. All I knew so far was how I descended from my father, based on conversation with him. But we had discussed nothing of the matrilineal. I am here at the end of many travels. I underestimate my exhaustion. I will meet my mother's family on another visit, I tell myself. The days unfold as if a lazy hand pulls open a window. I am bored. I cannot wait to leave. I keep the curtains drawn. I recline on the bed. I read in low light. I call faraway friends on the phone for directionless conversation. I write a short story about a land dispute. And when I venture to the streets, stirred by hunger, I meet a man who at once recognizes my father's face and mine. My name recalls the flashpoint of family tragedy and uncle's disappearance during the Biafran War. Emmanuel, a name my father didn't recall, was my uncle's until my grandmother pointed it out to him when they visited Afikpo the 1st December after my birth. In its literal meaning, the name affirms a presence, God with us. The last time they saw my uncle was in the final year of the war. He wore a bandage around his arm. He had come in secret to tell them he was okay, would be okay. Only a matter of time now, the end was in sight. No one would see him after that or receive news of his death. How could my father forget his brother bore my name? But he couldn't have. Remembering is not a mere act of will. In Afikpo, our names denote an unbroken link to the ancestors. The knowledge of the past is passed down in repressed retellings. My name is the fragment of a memory my father couldn't articulate at the moment of my birth. I am the one who returned, who returns. I am the recalcitrant returnee. I seek my uncle's image. My father has told me there is a surviving photograph of him. I know there is a bookcase in the sitting room of the family house, at the entrance of which another uncle who built it had inscribed, because it is mine. In previous trips, I went to the bookcase in search of the books my father read as an undergraduate, perusing with a boy's uncomprehending mind. On this visit, the bookcase is nothing but a container for tattered books and papers in an uninhabited room with broken shutters. The books I see, if their covers remain, are solid with fingerprints. Or sometimes the pages are torn in two. I can tell these are not the traces of inquisitive hands, but of minds long disaffected. If as a boy I stared at the bookcase as a sacred reminder of my father's student days, the children of my relatives treat it as a curious plaything from the past. Before pulling the bookcase open, I forget what the photograph is alleged to depict. My uncle standing with his malnourished siblings, his arms swathed in bandages, or my uncle sitting on a pile of broken rock, his back to our town's only secondary school, wearing bell-bottomed trousers. I lift book after book seeking the photo album. What I perceived at the moment of entering the house becomes true. The album hasn't survived years of disregard. I fold my arms in silent rage. I look above the bookcase and see that even other photographs of my uncle who built the house, my cousins as babies, and my grandparents in their rare couple photograph have been taken away. Built with mud bricks in the 1970s, badly maintained, it survives in the 2000s as a dingy house. Any day now it might cave in, retaining its use through nostalgia or family law. My uncle's photograph is unreachable. I do not know his face. As if until I find him, what he looked like, my name remains suspect, and I a fake copy. In my earliest recollection of Afikpo, I danced at a funeral. This memory originates from a video. I am seen beside my brother. It's dusty ground. Looking closely, I see the air around our feet spread in brown spirals. I notice our frenzied arrhythmic dancing. We have caught the attention of an encircling crowd. They smile at us, but around the edges of each smiling face, pity. As adults, they know what we don't. Yet in their glance, they tell us, even as I watch many years later, what we would come to know. A woman dear to us is being buried. Without a body, figments of memory. As the video progresses, my father shepherds us towards the center of the crowd. He's dancing too. He's increasingly expressive. His hands high, his body doubling, his head bumping. These are gestures of surrender. If stoicism could be illustrated in a dance, it would be as his dancing body. He taunts grief. He's consumed by grief. He jigs as if realizing the finality of her death. Through dancing, he is desperate to survive her. I am in Afikpo again, now almost 20. It's the first time I'm shown her grave, which is few yards from a narrow path, unmarked. It enrages me, her grave without inscription. The person who takes me there, a cousin, points out in a hushed tone, in a voice acknowledging in part the tragedy of her death and the fact that we've all moved on. In that moment, I remain fixed to the spot, staring at her grave plastered with grey mud, beside a narrow path. This proximity to the road, I realize as I write now, gives it a name. Every passerby will see the grave beside the road. Her memory is preserved in a stranger's glance. So for effect, I'll drink water. I was in Lagos last week, and this is off script. This is how they say it, off cuff. And someone asked me, when were you the happiest when you were writing this book? And I spent about 20 seconds stuttering, and I started saying stuff like, I'm not a sad person, I'm a happy person, I consider myself a happy person. But I realized I'd never thought about it. And in my mind, actually, I didn't think I was writing a sad book. But I think it's a sad book. Sadness is good for your health. Throughout the years of writing, sometimes while on the road, guided by the fever of the incident, or sometimes back on my desk, long after the moment had passed. Can you hear me? The image of what I hurtled towards was indistinct, a form seen from afar in a vast plain where every bulge has potential. Could I write a sentence capable of saving my life? If this nagging question is too grandiose and romanticizes what writing can do for a writer, that is exactly what I want, an overestimation of my capabilities. Since at the beginning of writing A Stranger's Pose, I thought experience primary and form secondary. an underestimation of where I'll arrive after years of work on a book, like a slight touch capable of hauling a burly body down a flight of stairs. But experience is only as interesting as the manner in which it is recalled. Hardly anyone who can convey emotion is incapable of telling a story, but few can set a narrative without dross. Few can set down a narrative without dross. At the precise point it loses triviality. Thousands of worthless words later, I sought a method. I began to write in fragments, in spots and bursts, not with the aim to resolve, but to reveal. I was setting 2 sentences in conversation. The first sentence from A Life Full of Holes, a book by Dries Ben Hamed Chahadi, translated by Paul Bowles from Maghrebi Arabic. Even a life full of holes, a life of nothing but waiting, is worse than no life at all. End of quote. The second sentence from John Berger's And Our Faces, My Heart Brief as Photos. Without a name, without a home, everything is fragmentation. End of quote. I came to Chahadi through Ito Barada's A Life Full of Holes, the Straight Project, her photographic work examining the dreams of North African migrants and their influence on Tangier. In the early months of writing, I turned to photographs, whether by photographers I traveled with, by those I encountered on the road, or in a number of occasions, those I found when neck deep in the subject, fleeing. The photographs, some of which I include in the book, most of which I do not, became signposts on the road to greater acuity. And yet, much of what I hoped the photographs would illuminate, for instance, the extent of the despair of those who made their way from Africa to Europe, was ineffable. Can my book be read as a collection of reflections on photography? I hope so. While I was a student here, my conceit was to consider criticism as a narrative form, to explore meaning in photography in relation to the irresolvable mystery of experience. So I'll turn to the book and read about 2 passages or sections which in some way highlights sections on photography from the book. So if you have a copy, which I don't think anyone has, chapter 15. And I feel like this is Levi's favorite part. Because when I submitted my thesis, or when he read parts of it, this is one of the parts he highlighted, and he thought I was up to something. The image of a limping man flashed through my mind. He was Serge, the caretaker of the motel I stayed at in Abidjan. I could never tell when he came and went, if he came and went. One afternoon, I climbed down the stairs to dispose shredded paper, walking around the motel's small compound looking for a waste basket. "Pardon, monsieur," he said, and took the paper from my hand. Then he limped away. The manageress mistreated him. She scolded him at every opportunity. "He is bad omen for my business," she said to me. He had come from Fekasedougou, a town in northern Côte d'Ivoire. Anyone from there was as clueless as sheep. Every night she would ask me for a recap of the day's events. I would sieve through my encounters, making an effort to speak well of her city, for which she had nothing but praise. One of those nights, she talked about Serge as a misfit she must dispose of. "You know," she said, "people come here for pleasure." "Yes," I said, joking that I must be a bad customer since I didn't respond to the occasional taps on my door. "Well, that's okay," she said, "but you know that Serge once opened a room during the course of business. He apologized, but proceeded to sweep the floor. My girl and my customer, who were at the height of foreplay, had never seen anything like that. So stunned were they that they left him do the sweeping. Sometimes I would see Serge and the manageress having a chat in the compound. He would be washing a pile of clothes by hand with a large bowl beside him, and she would sit on a stool close to where he sat on the floor, resting his broken right foot. It would unnerve me when she laughed at something he said, since I could not tell if her laughter was sincere or in mockery. Their conversation would be in the conspiratorial manner of gossiping friends. Hours later, she would begin berating him again. Early one morning, policemen came for search. Before they pulled him away, one of them took a photograph with a tiny Kodak. "This is evidence that you were alive when we took you," he said. "After we are done, no one will recognize you." On the morning of my departure, the manageress gave me the resulting photograph. They sent it to her, she alleged, as the only guardian of his they knew. "You must keep it," she said to me, "because I don't want to keep seeing his face in my dreams." When I remembered Serge and his inexplicable arrest a few years later, I searched through my things for the photograph. By now, I had a stack of portraits, progenies of many short-lived encounters on the road. Which face belonged to Serge? Only one portrait seemed to be his, but behind it I had written, "A Nigerian in Libreville." Someone I know, born to devout Christian parents, came into this world a triplet. In their 12th year, both of her brothers died and her parents were thrown into mourning. Except in the first year of their children's lives, the bereaved couple had allowed only a few photographs of the triplets sitting together. Their Christian convictions had restrained them from taking more. By making photographs, they acquiesced to the demonic traditional Yoruba belief that twins were sacred children connected to the spirit world, whose entwined presence were to be commemorated forever. This was unbiblical, they said, for each of us would be judged by God separate from our kin. Yet, upon the death of their sons, and since during mourning we cast about in our mind for meaning, they became obsessed with having a photograph of their grown triplets, a permanent keepsake of an entwined existence. The only way they could do this was to reinvent, through photography, the Yoruba belief that when a twin died, an artisan had to be commissioned to carve a small effigy as a symbolic substitute for the soul of the deceased twin, or two small effigies if both twins died, so that the immortal soul of the departed will be hosted by the graven image, and the dead would remain as powerful as the living. And so her parents commissioned a photographer to take a picture of the girl, first dressed as herself and then dressed as her brothers. The photograph of the girl dressed as one of her brothers was then printed twice and placed on either side of the girl's image. The resulting picture showed the triplets sitting together. As an octogenarian, she recounted this to me, showing me the picture as her eyes were fighting tears. There are those who believe that cameras carry ghosts within them, and that ghosts come into view when a photograph is made. I remember an incident confirming this. As the story goes in the famished road, a photographer was taking pictures of a large group and then portraits of certain individuals within the group. An odd explosion followed the camera's flash. Stunned ghosts emerged from the light and melted at the photographer's feet. For each picture the photographer took, 5 in all, the ghost kept falling at his feet, still dazed by the flash. Fascinated by the camera, they climbed on him and clung to his arms and stood on his head. The photographer, who happened to be drunk, wasn't bothered to return to the studio, so he hung the camera on the nail in the house. The spirits encircled the camera. They kept pointing at it, talking in amazed voices. Were these ghosts who came into view as a result of the camera's flash the unseen replicas of the photographed individuals? So this morning, I darted between books. A preface, introductory paragraphs, passages between chapters, wondering what ideas would settle, a glimpse of my mind state in true form. A reader touches a multitude of proximate strangers. I suspect I am my truest self in light of another's perception, cast in vicarious light, held under the scrutiny of a definite pronoun. In Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, when I read of Milkman in the third person, when his life enters mine as one of many, I weigh all the claims made of him against those I make for myself in search of middle ground. Could I become, have I become, when would I become? Suppose we didn't have the stories of others to consider. Could our lives advance with little complication, like strands of an unfastened knot? No life is a single story. No action is without an echo. Remembered or imagined, the stories of others inflect ours in dreams and thoughts, bearing consequence. Like this, we regard the pain of others. Like this, we aren't alone. And so I would like to end before the Q&A with the stories of three men, Yeliman, Saliu, and Dr. Ba, I met in southeastern Senegal. And then there'll be questions after. And I can evade all your questions about how I wrote this book. It is possible to speak of Yeliman by observation. If you observe his gestures without sound, say with earplugs, all knowledge becomes decipherable by the movement of his hands. What it suggests when the fingers fold into a knuckle, the index finger points heavenwards, the palms are opened in explanation or supplication, the arms bend in parallel formation and in self-embrace, and when in a mid-sentence pause, a halved finger is brought close to the chin. Observe his penciling. It begins with faint and uncertain marks. During this initial action on the canvas, the pencil is blunt. But in the subsequent stage, once the pencil is sharpened, it makes surer marks. Line is added to line in gradual strokes of enlargement. After hours of toil and occasional erasing, the white canvas is covered in penciled letters. Observe his calligraphy. 8 finished paintings are strung along a cord. All the paintings are polychromatic. In the burst of colors, the letters are pronounced like incantations. The canvases contain sentences in Arabic, Wolof, and French. Observe his face. 64 and bald, his eyes are large, bulging, and appear heavy. What's most impressive on his face, however, are the threads of hair under his chin, around his lips, and which sprout from the holes of his ears and nose. They are a mass of gray and white. They do not only give away his refusal to shave, but also that he has not paid attention to his facial hair. Some are bristles, others are lengthy strands. Seen from a distance, he is a wise, aging man. In Sintian, at the cultural center where he's spending a month as an artist in residence, he quickly becomes a regular feature of dawn. He walks about the main building counting his prayer beads. For a moment, he stands in a pause. Otherwise, he paces in a circle. After half an hour, he sits on a chair. Given the design of the chair, his body appears aslant. His aslant body faces the direction of the gate. Towards the gate, he has fixed a contemplative gaze. Of Saliu's biography, there are only two things you should know. He came to Sintian with Yeliman as the calligrapher's assistant and friend. He is from Chicago and became a follower of Sheikh Ibrafal 7 years ago. Of all Saliu's travels, I tell only one. Of all Saliu's travel stories, I tell only one. Once, while he lived in Gambia, in a town between Sekunda and Brufut, he touched his buttocks and felt a painful lump. Several lumps also appeared on his legs. At this time, he was living with a Marabu called Dem, in a building with tarpaulin for a roof. Dilapidated for as long as anyone could remember, home to the homeless. He showed the lumps to them. Them said, "You crossed the path of a powerful charm intended for someone else. Let me take you to my village. There I will heal you." Saliu went with him to a village 2 hours by donkey cart from the Senegal border. There he was introduced to Dem's family and installed in a room. For 4 days, Dem remained in the forest of Casamance gathering medicine. When he returned, he made Saliu bath daily with herbs and barks and drink a bitter tea. After a few days, the lumps began to disappear, one after the other. Then he was well. But the Marabout would evade questions about returning to their town. In his village, business boomed. People came to him for charms, amulets, and prayers. And wasn't it remarkable, some of the villagers said to themselves, that his baraka was potent enough to attract a white man? After 2 weeks of sitting in the room given to him in Dem's village house, Saliu became impatient. He had a business at home, selling kafetuba from a tiny kiosk. He couldn't tell if the boys to whom he entrusted the business were doing a good job. Yet, broke as hell, he couldn't return alone. On New Year's Eve, he sought out a barber's shop. He walked until he crossed the border into Senegal. He found no barber. When he decided to return, he got to the border and met it shut. "We close the border at 6 p.m. daily," they told him. "And tomorrow it won't be open because we'll be celebrating New Year's Day." Brooding, Saliu walked about unsure of what to do. Then he met a boy of about 17. "I am looking for a barber," he told the boy. He was in luck. The boy was a barber, but kept his clippers with his friend. They took a motorbike to search for the friend. They found him and his clippers. Saliu was shaved. "I have no place to go," he told the boy. So they went to the boy's family in the village of Douala in the Casamance territory. Saliu was given food and clothes. After New Year's Day, he spent 2 additional days there. He walked about the village. In this southernmost part of Senegal, the Casamance River flows and curves along palm trees, mangroves, savanna grasses, paddy fields, and isolated villages. So much to see. When he returned to Dem's village, the entire family gathered in front of the house waiting. They swore at him, enraged. "Do you know what kind of problem you'll be in when a white man disappears from your house?" Dem told him, "Tomorrow we leave." But as if punishing him for being prodigal, Saliu journeyed home on the back of a donkey cart. He sat with goats for 8 hours. The donkey staggered from the weight and was struck mercilessly by the rider. For months afterwards, Saliu couldn't eat goat meat. The Marabout, contrary to the severity of his profession, was a light-hearted, goofy, and charming man with gap tooth. Customers came with varying requests. "I want you to bring my son home for a visit. Strike him with a sickness if that will make him return. I want you to make her fall in love with me. I want you to stop that person from hurting me. Send the evil back to the sender. I'm going to Europe to sell drugs, and I want protection from law enforcement. If they stab or shoot me, I want to remain unhurt." When customers arrived, he asked them to bring a candle, a thread, a bottle of soda, some bread, other food items. Those who brought food expected that by giving alms to homeless men, their petitions would be favorable. For almost a year, Saliu didn't have to worry about food. Before eating, all the squatters would mutter some verses of the Quran to increase the potency of the charms. The Marabout ordered them to intercede for his clients, specifying the needs and intended results. One night, Dr. Ba received a call. The voice on the other end was a sentient boy. "Dr. Ba, Dr. Ba, if you don't send money, they will kill me. I have been kidnapped in Libya." The boy helped around in the hospital. Then he disappeared, and no one heard from him until the night of the call. The next morning, the doctor went to Tambacounda and sent the money. When I met Dr. Ba, All I imagined was the strength of his slender fingers. He treats 12,000 patients a year, who come from a total of 10 surrounding villages, with Cynthian at the center. I rest when I can, he said. Those fingers carry an encyclopedic knowledge of the human body. In them are memories of all the pulses of everyone in Cynthian, touched in the past or future. An hour after he shook my hand, the smell of his fragrance remained on my palm. Thank you. Questions? I wanted to give a talk, and I hope I have. The idea was to sort of present, I guess, a glimpse into the book, read from some sections that hopefully would get you interested in it. I feel like there are some Nigerians here, so to answer that question in the affirmative would mean that I've betrayed my country. I would say in some senses, yes, for a number of reasons. I grew up traveling a lot around, moving a lot around Nigeria, and so growing up in 7 cities or so. And so to grow up in that way meant that I didn't think of myself first as, say, Igbo, which is, my ethnic group. I'm never sure how to refer to Igbo now, ethnicity or tribe. We sometimes in Nigeria they call it tribes. It's just such a derogatory way to refer to it. But I'm from the Igbo nation, as Chinua Achebe liked to call it. And growing up, it didn't feel to me that I was Igbo enough, whatever that meant at the time. I think I don't have those anxieties anymore. And so because of that, I'll always feel in some ways anxious about presenting myself as, as an Igbo person, which, ethnicity is one of the first ways people identify themselves in Nigeria. And so there was that kind of estrangement. Of course, once I became an adult and kind of understood the codes, the way to berate people, say something in pidgin and sound like you're strong, and it became easier to navigate the spaces. Especially living in Lagos, I lived in Lagos for about 2 years, and I could get by. So that's a very abstract way to answer that question. I think, especially because I now live in New York, every time I return to Nigeria, I feel like there's something I understand about Nigeria that I never understood. And so one can think of that as a form of estrangement. For days, depending on the availability of Mamadou, I had no guide in Dakar. It amuses me now that I remember how I walked in Point R, nervous of what world was possible without English words. My French and Wolof constituted no more than a sentence when combined. Once, overlooking the sea in Angor, my eyes followed the paths the surfers made as they performed their stunts. I see what rivers, the Nile in a stretch beyond the Mediterranean, the Niger as it joins Timbuktu to Lokoja, teach with their flowing mass. Wave falls on wave as one dialect inflects on another. All rivers are multilingual. I was nothing without the translators to whom my questions were entrusted, whether in Bamako, Abidjan, or Casablanca. But alone, as was often the case, I wondered how to survive without them. There were practical ways to go about surviving in Francophone Africa, such as being in Rabat and going to places that I know the waiters spoke English, so I could eat. Walking around, I just hoped that I didn't get arrested because that would complicate things. But, trying to eat, you just point to, you understand a few French words, and there's poulet, it means chicken. And And there's some kind of, I understood a few French words to get by, especially when I saw them written. So that was the code. And then I worked, either when I was traveling with a group or when I was traveling alone, they were translators. So you could at least ask questions, and then take long walks with your earplugs on, and nobody asks you questions, Just hope that you look black enough, not to be questioned. When I was a kid, there was a close relative that died. It was so fundamental to, I guess, our lives at the point, which is what I was describing at the end of the book. So when I felt that I was writing a book about grief, I was thinking about her. But it's so uncanny that I was writing about my father all along, I was writing about him, situating him within that grieving, in a sense. So then the writing becomes in some way prophetic, which is bizarre. And it's something that I'm still trying to understand. What does it mean for me to have started grieving my father even before he died? And only now realizing that I've written about my father in a bereft manner before he passed on. So the big question for me now in my writing is what part of my consciousness as a person gets to a place that I can get to in the moment. The second question is easier to answer because I did meet people who had spent years, for instance, trying to get from, say, North Africa to Europe. Many years. I mean, some said, 5 years I've been on the road. And they had like a very acute sense of what home meant, which it meant that they had left home. And that was the very definition of home for them. And also they were in this sort of limbo, right? Some kind of purgatory, where they were trying to get to the other side, regardless of what the cost of getting to the other side was. This is what I struggled to understand throughout writing the book. And so I couldn't understand that, How could you know that 2 weeks ago, hundreds of people perished in the Mediterranean, and you still can say the sea is the only way? That was, for me, the most revelatory moment in Tangier, meeting someone from Abidjan who said, pointing towards the sea is the only way. The sea is the only way. I don't think I can even understand that now. And so to know that he had left home and that he was going to Europe, or he was hoping that he would get to Europe, which would not be home, was some kind of paradox that I could never really untangle. So the strategy, and maybe to take 7 books to do that, the strategy was to let that stand, right? Because for many of the people who I met, complexity was essential to their lives, right? It wasn't about pity me, I'm trying to get to Europe, or, the worst thing that can happen in my life is if I get on that boat and die. So from our point of view, that's what we'll think, right? From the point of view of anyone talking about migration in a political sense, it's simply like, why would you do this to yourself? Why would you get on a car, a 4x4 and drive into the deserts, right? But from their point of view, it's a little bit more complex than that. And it's not simply looking for a better life, right? Because they know stories they've heard of people who get into Europe and their lives are not necessarily better. So the story is very complex. And so how do you render, especially writing in fragments, in this very, I guess, elusive way, that complexity, that alienation. But then, of course, for me, the question of home is, I used to think that it was trite. I used to think that I didn't have to answer it, so, a year ago or 2 years ago, if you had asked me, I would dismiss the question, I don't want to answer it. But we can be home anywhere. Home is not soil but soul. All kinds of romantic notions of what home is. I do think that one can think about home in a spiritual sense, as like soul part of it. But I also feel that people ground themselves in certain ways, and only recently, especially given the tragedy in my family, did I realize that, oh my God, I'm so far away. It felt like my sorrow was blunted by distance. That there was a certain kind of way I could mourn if I were in Nigeria, of course, with my family, with people who I'd shared this person with, that I couldn't anymore because I'm far away. And then someone pointed out to me that, of course, if you're making the journey across the Atlantic, is the Middle Passage, even though you're flying by air. And so to really understand that my journey, of course, I'm not saying it's as severe as like the Middle Passage, but there's some kind of, that's a way to understand the severity of that, of that movement. Yeah. And so, of course, Glissant is my favorite philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers. And I recount a story in this book where, Mantia Diawara is making a film called One World in Relation on Glissant. And Glissant asked him, how can I simplify your ideas for a wider audience? Most important story in my life, actually. And Glissant turns to him and say, if I were you, you could do something very simple. Just point the camera at this mass of water, the Atlantic Ocean, and that would be my ideas in one shot. So as I mentioned, I was starting to write my thesis, which, by the way, to be given that kind of opportunity to do anything, so when usually I tell the students here that, do anything, and as Claudia Larocco, who was my thesis supervisor, said to me, said in an interview, actually, not to me, and excuse my French, as they say. Why is it French? You can fuck around as much as you want, but the stakes are high. Or in another way to think about it is that you can be as vulnerable, vulnerability has high stakes. So I was thinking about, doing this walk that felt like mongrel, felt very bizarre. How do I write about years of traveling, but also submit it as my thesis in an art criticism and writing program? And of course, imagining that I would disappoint both my family and my teachers after I was done, because it didn't seem critical enough. And I was still obsessed with, trying to smuggle in fiction into criticism and write a novel that could also pass as some kind of like critical text. And the novel is large enough to contain all kinds of ideas and possibilities. And, telling yourself all those things that are true in theory, but, once you start writing, become impossible to conjure, right? And so that distance, how do I close the gap between all these ideas I have about the possibilities of narrative and actually the actual writing? So I wrote the first draft, I wrote like 16,000 words. I used to be a little bit more prolific than I am now. And actually it's this book that made me less prolific. So I write 16,000 words, writing this very vague story about my travels, but fictionalizing myself. And my classmates and Claudia saw it and said, excuse me, this is not working. And I started thinking, how could I tell these stories? How could I write about my experience? And I remember I was on the train, actually, and I just thought to myself, I had been collecting photographs, on my computer, I had a folder on my computer that had a lot of photographs, either taken by me or by friends, some kind of unwieldy guide, you know, to the travels. And so I decided to start looking at the photograph and seeing what they could help me remember, in a sense, about being on the road. And that was it, you know. Once I did the first 2 fragments, I knew that I had found a form. But of course, not all the photographs I was thinking about then, or, you know, I was writing to, in a sense, you know, I eventually reproduced, because of course, the process through which you get, like, you know, all the rights for photographs is also another nightmare. So I was extremely fortunate that I had either collaborated with photographers while on the road, so I sort of had joint rights to the photos, or photographers who were really close friends, you know, like Dawit L. Petros, whose image is on the cover, and who I had traveled with. So he had made this incredible body of work that was also informed by the notion of estrangement and being a stranger. So it's called The Stranger's Notebook. And, you know, the number of those photos from that project reproduced here. And so by the time I was editing the book and started thinking about what images I actually wanted to include, I really just started reaching out to photographers who I had looked at their work, written about their work, and basically asking for favors that I hope they don't ask me to repay them, because it's impossible. But then of course, by this time, by the end of writing, by the time I was editing this book, I had, you know, years of some kind of, I guess, testing this notion of how photographs can work with text, beside text, you know, how it can inform, push against, push into text. And I'd written most of the stories, you know, so it became a question of evocation. How do I include a photograph that does not necessarily trivialize the story or illustrate the story, but take the story into a different direction? So that, you know, that something happening between the photographs and the text became the real question for me. The famous realization is that you're black after you come from Nigeria. And it's not, I mean, you know, I used to take that for granted until I realized that if I had to be in America, I had to think about it in some way. So that's America. But the first thing to say is that there is, in a sense, it's difficult to articulate the notion of black flânery. You know, the idea that you could be black and be a flaneur. Because it depends on what side, as I used to think then, on what side of the Mediterranean you are. So if, of course, you're in Europe, you could be a flaneur without a black body. But on the other side of the Mediterranean, the British colonial laws in Egypt, you know, especially, would penalize people for being idlers, right? You know, so if someone is just strolling around, you could be arrested. And this made it into many colonial laws of the time. So to realize that the colonial project, you know, was in some ways racially charged. And so many, I mean, in Nigeria, race is not how we think about being an order, for instance. You know, we don't think of, you know, my black body in Nigeria. You just think about belonging to one ethnic group. But I had to come to a point where I realized that if you're going to decolonize, you also have to realize that you would try to undo the racially charged project of colonialism. And that's still, it's too complex for me to start unraveling now. I'm still trying to get to a place where I can move past what Nigeria has done to itself or to its citizens. And then maybe I could work my way to, you know, racism as a colonial, or colonialism as a racial construct. That's very abstract, but that's how I'm thinking about it. Yeah. So I've not thought that far, you know.
That's why you should hire me as your PA.
Oh yeah, yeah. I haven't thought that far, and now that you say it, it occurs to me that, of course, there has to be a new kind of dance between the text and the image if it's in, say Arabic, which has a different kind of like visual valence from, say, English, right? There's a way Arabic, just simply how it appears on the page. And because, for instance, graphic design is essential to my thinking, I believe that you should use the right fonts. You can't clutter the page, in that sense. So if I were going to be translated in Arabic, which I hope I would, because I had that. In some ways, the book is a conversation with Arabic. I don't know. I think it will really depend on the translator. But also if the photographers would still give me the rights to reproduce the book in that, their images in another language. Don't do a book like this. It's very... do a book like this if you want to, but I mean that it's a very complicated process, especially in relation to the images. So I don't know. I think it will be on a case-by-case basis and what makes sense at that time. Part of the big questions I was asking myself while traveling is, what are the legacies of Pan-Africanism, if there are? Such a huge concept, in many senses failed, The project of Pan-Africanism, once the Francophone and the Anglophone began to butt heads in Festac 77 in Nigeria, that just, ended. Nigeria had a lot of money and oil, money, petrodollars. And so they were like, we can bring black people from China and have a conversation about blackness. Significant, thinking about the question you asked, Laden. But the French, with the negritude movement, weren't having any of that, And Senghor, of course, didn't think that you could articulate blackness in that kind of yeah. So thinking about the legacies of Pan-Africanism while I'm traveling and realizing that, of course, there are many Africas. There are as many Africas as one can say, possibly say the word Africa, or more, and it's simple, Africa is not a country. It's now so, such a cliche that one has to be particular about being particular about it, That when you travel to parts of the continent, to a part of the continent, don't say you went to Africa. Say the name of the city. Say the name of the country. In fact, say the name of the city more than you say the name of the country. And so you still see people like Mr. West say, I'm going to produce my next music in Africa. Like, bros, you are not going to Djibouti to produce your music, You're going to a particular African country, most likely Cape Town. So that's it. How do I translate the complexity of the continent, That is the message, and one can be very evangelical about that the continent is very complex. So I chose not to speak of, I guess, my experiences traversing, and, being the hero of my own story, That's what, what travel writing does, situates this mostly white man traveling in Africa as the hero. So he's met all these near savages, and he survives, and so he tells you the story of how he survived. I was more interested in how do I look like a stranger to the people I'm meeting, which leads to the next question. It was very deliberate for me not to write a book about encounters, fleeting encounters that weren't necessarily, or stories that weren't necessarily resolved. That's the prompt of the book in a very broad sense. And so one of the ways to do that in such a way that fact-checking wouldn't be a problem is to keep everyone anonymous. And I don't say that in a way that it's like, oh, dismissing it. I couldn't meet these people again in many cases. I couldn't, I mean, at most you collect a number, but when are you going to be in Mauritania in Nouakchott? Again. And that's not happening. I don't even want to go there, at this point. If you paid me to go, I'll probably go if you're an NGO. I wouldn't go. But, and so when next would I be in Nouakchott or Nouadhibou? And so, but you had a significant, you had an encounter with someone that felt significant. And so how do you write a story in a way that if you were to present it to the person, it will feel true? And there were a number of those cases, at least 3 cases where the people I wrote about read what I had written, and we talked about, or they sent me a note and said, oh, I read that was funny, or or these are the obvious mistakes you made, but it's fine. You didn't name me. So that always works. Anonymity always works. Yeah, but of course I know you're a professor of journalism, so I wouldn't take your class. Because I'll fail. There's a simple answer, and there's a slightly more evolved one, or involved.
That one, the involved one.
The involved one, okay. The involved answer is that the book was written over the course of 4 years. And it's a little book, actually, although it looks like a lot. We used photographs to fill up the spaces. And I had written parts of it, or when I submitted the draft to my publisher, my editor sent back notes saying, you need to expand this book, You have more in you. We know you have more in you, so do more work and expand this book. And on some occasions, there were other things I was writing that I didn't realize was kind of part of the book. But until I got that prompt, I felt like, okay, this can work in this book in this way. Maybe if I rewrote it, or if I sort of put it after a certain, section. So that's how, in a broad sense, that's how the book was written. When I got to the last part, I knew I wanted to write about my hometown at the end, the complicated relationship I had with that place, I still have with that place. In the sense that it's a very important place for my family, but I'd never spent time there besides visiting. So, it was important for my father to build a house there, because that's what you did, after your retirement, you went to the house you had built in the place where you were born, where the language you speak, you grew up in. So I knew towards the end, I kind of knew I was going to write about that place. But what I didn't know was that I was going to write about this, this grave, this unmarked grave. And so once I wrote that part, I remember that morning, once I wrote it, I just felt like this is it. Even if I were to write anything else, it can't come after this. This has to be the end. And not until I read Levi's blog, where, he basically frames the book as begins with a glance, ends with a glance. Did I understand that? I've done good with my life. Yeah. So once I had ended with the glance, I felt that was it. There was nothing else to do. It felt right, more than anything else. Yeah. I don't consider myself an itinerant. I think it's a useful concept, itinerancy, but also the notion of being settled matters to me in some kind of way, not settled enough that won't allow me to do all the usual shenanigans of traveling from place to place, doing some work, but settled in the sense that I have a place simply that contains my books. Yeah, it's too much now, it's getting bigger, the library is like, I need to either afford to buy a house, win a lot of money, there are all these grants they give people, $600,000. In case you're one of those that nominate people for the Genius Award, I'm just putting out there that I would like to have one. I think my family considers me a genius. But my family is not nominating me for that. So if I could find a way, find a place that would mean that much to me, I hope that I can find a place that will mean that much to me, that will feel like I can, even if I'm spending time away from here, this is where I consider I want to walk from. I'm hoping for that. I'm hoping for that.
Here or in Nigeria?
I can't answer that. And that's too early to answer. I mean, I'll tell you one thing today and change my mind tomorrow. If I get that grant, that's a different conversation. It means that, like Chrysophilia, I can move to Trinidad and just chill. It's like, well, I'll talk to you 10 years later. Find a cheap place in the world, no commitments, just writing. As long as you can still afford plane tickets, I'll take that. Yeah. I'm kind of evading the more complex answer to that, which is, more theoretical, right? The question of, I don't think I can answer. I think I'm thinking of it squarely in a practical way at this point in my life, what is being afforded to me? What are the opportunities I have, and how can I test them for their correctness, Yeah, this is a book about form, actually. I think there was an interviewer that said to me, she had read it and she said, I thought this was a book about form more than anything else. And I felt so happy because the most important question I have, for myself as a writer is that of form. And this is something I'm still, and I say that actually hesitantly, because, there are such large questions that I want to address, the Biafran War, such a huge concept. But then I realized that if I haven't figured out form, then it's just really another story about the Biafran War, for instance. And so going into this book, I knew that I didn't want to write a traditional travel book, because I wasn't even considering myself a travel writer. I was simply a writer who had happened to have a travel experience. And so it wasn't until, I began to pitch the book to publishers, for instance, that it seemed right to say, this is a travelogue. But it's not necessarily a travelogue, it's a little bit more exhaustive than that, So figuring out a form was simply a question of figuring out what fragments worked. It was, once I started writing in fragments, I knew that all I had to do was to say to myself, this doesn't work or this works, right? And then there were moments where I would decide that, okay, I'm going to write about, my love affair, And, it's such a good story to write about, being, I don't want to give it too much about my, but when you have a long distance relationship, and for some reason, this is speaking hypothetically, it ends, right? And it ends while you're traveling. You think to yourself, this is such a great story because I'm writing about being away. And someone has left me because I'm away. So it opened up something in the writing where I could think about, what it means to address a lover from the trip itself. And that was one section of the book. which is kind of, it's a letter, so it had to have like an addressee. So that's another form of another section of the book is written as letters to this imaginary lover. So there were all kinds of decisions that were made on the spur of the moment, in a sense. What I felt could fit within this like container. This, as Claudia mentioned, autobiography becomes a porous container. But it's a container, but it's porous. So I had figured out that I wanted the container to be fragmentary. Now what do I put in that? Does that help? Okay, the final question, I think. We've tried to trace it in my family, and all kinds of meanings appear, and at this point I just think it sounds nice. But I'll take that meaning, because part of my, I guess what I'm thinking a lot about now is to write about place. So maybe I would imagine that Iduma means this, place. And I'll do that work. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay.